Hey, welcome to episode 25 of Reinventing Thyself. And today we are going to dive into the gap. Yes, I am going to give you some must-knows that you absolutely want to put in your back pocket as you move through the gap. Stay tuned. We all have situations, experiences, and moments in our life when we know deep at our core we have to do something different. We have to pivot. And regardless of how big or small that pivot is, it requires us to change something in our life. And that change can feel really uncomfortable. However, it is that change that is creating something entirely new. And it is that newness that creates a very different way of life in one area or multiple areas of our life. What's this all about? It is all about reinventing thyself. My name is Michelle Shutter, and I'd like to welcome you to Reinventing Thyself. I am so glad that you joined me today, because it is here that we'll move beyond our old self, our old identity, and that trailer of garbage from the past that we like to pull into the future, but really need to ditch that hitch. It is here that we'll move into that place of reinvention and embracing the newness of it all. Are you ready to step into reinventing thyself? Because guess what? It is never too late, and your time is now. Let's get started. So welcome back to this week's episode 25, as I mentioned. My name is Michelle Shutter, and I'm super excited to have you here with me today, that you are carving out some time to invest in yourself. This doesn't cost you anything but some time, and this time can be spent listening while you're going for a walk or doing some laundry, or perhaps even just driving in your car. Just what some great opportunity for you to invest in yourself. And there's a few things that I've learned, because it's been a hot few weeks since I published a podcast, and I'm going to get into that in this week's episode. But here's a few things that I've learned when it comes to reinventing yourself in some way. And that is, you really have to lean into the pivot. Now, that pivot isn't always comfortable. It shows up for some reason. Sometimes we're excited about it and we're ready to move forward, and other times we're not. And it's really important that we still learn to lean into that pivot, that we embrace the change and all the lessons to be learned. And again, I'm going to share that with you in this episode. And then we want to move boldly through that new beginning and beyond. And there's one more piece that I'm going to add to that today. So, as I mentioned, I took some time off yet again from recording an episode. And one of the reasons why I did that is because I really didn't want to multitask. I didn't want to divide my energy, divide my resources, and really do things at a level that didn't serve at a higher level. And that's easy to do when you're a woman, when you're a mom, when you have multiple responsibilities going on, that you think, oh my gosh, I have to do this and this and this. And at a point then you become exhausted in it. So this time around, I decided, you know what? I'm just going to step back and let all my energy be centered around upgrading and evolving, because I really noticed something, not only with myself, but also with other women. And it's become really evident over the last few years as well, and you can imagine why. But it's really this space of the gap. And the gap is, you're here and you want to go here. So if you're watching this episode rather than listening, I have two fingers up. And so one of the fingers is two index fingers, keep in mind. One of the fingers is where you are, and the other finger is where you want to go. And the space between those two is called the gap. Now, here's what happened to me when I took some time off. It was really about finding your greatness in the gap. And so many times we think that gap is, it should be going at a faster speed, or it should be easier, or we try to diminish everything that comes up in the gap, and we try to suppress it, and move it away so that we can hustle more and move forward in a quicker pace. But yet it all comes back to the same point. Like, we never fully get to the end of that gap. And what I found was we're not completely utilizing our greatness in the gap. And that's where I spent some time these last few weeks, is really exploring the gap and how can we bring our greatness out in the gap. And I want you to keep in mind that the gap doesn't have to be this big, audacious goal. It can be something as simple as, I want to have a productive day, or I want to cross a few things off my list. The gap is something that absolutely everyone experiences. And you experience it the minute you decide you want to change, the minute you decide you want to do something new, the minute you decide you want a different result. So perhaps yesterday wasn't as a productive day as you wanted. Today you made this decision, I want to have a more productive day. That puts you in the gap. Perhaps you want something better for your health, and maybe you want to lose X number of pounds. That puts you in the gap. The minute you decide, you're in the gap. Now, again, as I mentioned, everyone experiences the gap. It's not exclusive to you. So take a sigh of relief, because some of the things that came up for me when I've been in a gap is I always felt like, oh my gosh, this is only happening to me. How is this even possible? And that isn't true. Okay, so relax and know that there are others that are in the exact same situation as you, and that you are experiencing the gap exactly the way you're supposed to. That part is exclusive to you. But when you are in that mindset of, this is only happening to me, that isn't true. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, the one thing about the gap is that we're always in it. And you might be like, oh my gosh, like I'm never going to get out of the gap. No, generally we don't. And here's why. Because when you start at this point, so my index finger's up, and you move and you meet the end result, that second finger, which is your end result, you now have the opportunity to evolve, to expand, to upgrade, and then redevelop a new gap that continually allows you to grow and to really step into a different version of yourself. Now, we can enter the gap both consciously and unconsciously. And that can be a little tricky, especially if you are not conscious of being in the gap based on a decision you made. Now, those conscious and unconscious decisions can vary between people. But when you're in the gap, you obviously want to have awareness that you're there, awareness of what's coming up for you, where you want to go, all of that. That's so important in the gap. Now, as I mentioned before, I spent some time in the gap, but I also spent time observing other people in the gap. And what I wanted to do was bring something new to not only myself, but also women that are in the gap. Because, as I mentioned, these last few years have been really tricky for a lot of people. And the one thing that I know for certain is that when you enter the gap, you enter as one person. You enter the gap as your current familiar person, your current familiar self. However, that end result is not the same person. So that space, that gap, requires you to step into a new version of yourself, to reinvent thyself in some way. And you have to be willing to make that change. Now, a lot of times unconsciously, we even sabotage ourselves in this space because we don't want to let go of what is familiar to us, what feels good to us. Even if it doesn't serve us, it still feels good to us. And so we stay as our old familiar self. Well, unfortunately, that's like trying to put a square peg into a round hole. It doesn't work. It doesn't serve us. And when we're in that space, we allow a lot of excuses to come in. We allow a lot of confusion, or I don't know, to really take precedent almost, to be at the forefront. And that is not what serves us. Now, this is exactly what happened to me when I took this space between podcast recordings. And it's been a few weeks. Like, honestly, I have all the skill sets that I need to develop something new in terms of a website, recording a podcast, recording videos, editing, building out a website, a web page, a capture page. I mean, like, all of that skill set, like, I already have. I spent a lot of time just teaching myself and trial and error, and like, I know all that. And yet I was able to allow myself, good or bad, to step into those excuses, to step into that confusion, to that I don't know. And so what I realized was I need to sit in this space a little bit more and figure out what is going on. And yet under all that confusion, under all those excuses, under all those I don't knows, under all that avoidance, that procrastination, was this space of fear that was trying to mask it all, in a sense. And it was trying to mask all that junk that still continues to come up, that place of worthiness, that place of self-doubt. Will this really impact women, what I'm putting together? Will this really support them? And so all of that energy, the energy that really didn't support my growth, was trying to come in. And one thing I experienced was that all of those energies had additional lessons to teach me. And those additional lessons, I got to explore. I got to look at those deeper. And rather than just trying to push them away or shove them back into a closet or bury them deep in a drawer, because like, I want to be positive and I want to move through this, it wasn't about that. In the gap, what I've learned is that we have to allow both ranges to coexist. We have to allow the positive energies, the ones that make us feel really good inside, and we have to allow the negative energies, the ones that don't feel so good inside. We can't experience the positive without experiencing the negative, and you can't experience the positive without experiencing the negative, and vice versa, right? I think I just said that same thing twice. Or the negative and experience the positive. You get what I'm talking about. So it's really that space of, how do I be both and in this gap and allow everything to coexist? Because that is what will serve me at a deeper, greater level. Now, the one thing I realized is that the gap is really tricky. It's so sneaky. And as I mentioned before, it's because we enter as our current self, and we have to try, not have to try, we must change ourselves to get to that end result. And we have to change it in a variety of ways, right? A physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, like whatever you're working on, could be all of those or one or a few of those. And the challenge is that our old self, the one we enter the gap as, is more powerful. It's stronger than the new self, the end result. Why? Because we haven't built the strength. We haven't built the muscle, the discipline yet of the new self. We haven't stepped into that end person. We haven't fully explored what it will require us of to be that end person. And so when I looked at the gap, I realized, oh my gosh, there is so much greatness to be had, to be found, to be experienced in the gap. And yet we don't allow ourselves to experience it all. We try to push our way through it, or hustle our way through it, or harderholic our way through it. But yet, in the gap, there's so much to be learned. And there's three ways that we learned in life in general, not just in the gap, but especially in the gap, is education, right? Like, can we take time to educate ourselves, to learn and apply something to help us move forward in the gap? Can we have conversations? Can we have conversations with other people that perhaps have gone through it or can support us in some way? And then is observation. And I find that the way that we learn observation is the trickiest when we're in the gap because we're so close to it. It's pretty hard at times to really put self-accountability on us, our self-responsibility, and really to call out our bullshit. Like, we have a hard time doing that because, again, we're so close to it. So I want to share with you just these 3 must-knows in terms of the gap, so that when you are moving through the gap, when you step into the gap, that you, again, realize that these things are going to serve me. The gap is going to serve me in really finding my greatness and developing and evolving my greatness. So the first one is that gap is created as soon as you make a decision that you want to experience something else. You want to have a new result, a new goal, but keep in mind, it doesn't have to be this big, audacious goal. It can be something really super simple. And I alluded to that earlier in that it can be just, I want to have a more productive day. Yesterday is in the past. It didn't serve me. I didn't get anything done. But today, I want to have a more productive day. So who do you have to be? And this gap can be really short, right? Because it's just one day. Who do I have to be to move through that and become more productive in my day? The second must know is that gap is super sneaky. And I talked about this as well earlier. And the gap is super sneaky because all those old belief patterns, those old stories, those old beliefs, the old experiences, they like to surface to the top. And when they surface to the top, guess what comes along with them? Oh, the old vicious voice. And that vicious voice is like a sea creature, and it wants to have this conversation with you, and it wants to sit on your shoulder and just chirp in your ear. And so when you have that vicious voice really talking in your ear all the time, it makes it pretty challenging to move through the gap. And we don't always take note of that from an observation place. And that's why I said observation is one of the trickiest in the gap. And the third must know is that the gap is not exclusive just to you. The way the journey through the gap is, but a circumstance also happens to other people. It's not just you. So don't go into that stage, or almost that pity, that victimy, that, oh, this never happens, that Debbie Downer, in a sense, because it isn't exclusive to you. Now, your greatness, I can't even begin to tell you enough that your greatness is found in the gap. Stop looking for your greatness in outside validation, in outside material things, because you're never going to find it there. The greatness is found in the gap. But unfortunately, we want to run from it. we don't like to experience the gap, or we want to move through the gap so quickly that we lose all the opportunities to gain from the lessons that are to be learned there. So I have a question for you. What would be different for you if you could not only step into your greatness that's in the gap, but you could also accelerate your results and move forward with ease? What would be different for you if you could do that? And my second question for you is, would it be worth an hour of your time, perhaps even a little bit less? Could you invest an hour of your time to really explore finding your greatness in the gap? Because if you answered yes, then I want to extend my invitation to you for my webinar that is called exactly that, Finding Greatness in the Gap. Because I have so much that I want to share with you in that will absolutely support you in finding your greatness in the gap. And one of the things that I'm going to dive into are the pitfalls. There absolutely are pitfalls in the gap, and if you don't know about those, guess what? It is going to take you longer to move through the gap. And if that's how you decide you want your journey to be, so be it. That's super cool. But if you don't want your journey through the gap to be like that, then perhaps you want to know what the pitfalls are. And that's just one of the things that I'm going to dive into on this webinar. Also know that as of right now, I don't have a recording offered. So I have the link to the webinar will be in the description or in the notes as well. But you can go to www.greatnessinthegap.com. That's all one word, greatnessinthegap.com. And you can save your spot there. I also have put together a Facebook group that I'm just starting where it is all about women supporting one another in the gap, through the gap, evolving out of the gap, upgrading from the gap, experiencing the gap in general. And that group is Women Finding Greatness in the Gap. I will also put a link there below. Now, that webinar, I can tell you, is going to be jam-packed, full of everything that you will need to move through the gap and really experience it in a way that lights you up, that fulfills you, that really allows your greatness to move forward and expand and evolve, and also to just be okay with the coexisting of it all. Because as I mentioned, we can't experience the positive of the gap without knowing the negative. So why can't we just allow it to coexist? So again, if that webinar is something that you would like to save your spot at, I invite you to register at greatnessinthegap.com. So as I wrap up today, finding your greatness in the gap requires you to reinvent thyself. That's what this whole podcast is about. And we're going to, as I go forward, we will explore the gap even more and explore it in terms of bringing your greatness to light and really finding your greatness in the light, but in the gap. But as I started this podcast, there are things that we learn as we experience the gap. And those things are lean into the pivot. It's showing up for a reason. Embrace the change and the lessons that you are learning. Move boldly through the new beginning and beyond. And 4, find your greatness in the gap. Thanks for tuning in today. I look forward to seeing you on the webinar. Until next time. Well, what are you waiting for? Whether you've pivoted and are unsure, or you're on the verge of pivoting, there is no better time than now for you to begin. Want to know why? Because if it wasn't the right time, the pivot wouldn't have shown up. And to get you started, I've got 3 shortcuts to reinventing thyself. Just head on over to www.reinventingthyself.com and you can download it there. And don't forget to message me with the shortcut that resonates with you the most. One last thing, I know you and I are not the only ones that have leaned into the pivot. Be sure to share this with others so they can be supported too. And from the bottom of my heart, thank you for supporting me and sharing this message. Until next time.